Hey fellow cosmic hobbyists! With so many ships heading out to explore the stars, they're bound to need repairs. So CQH Aerospace is scratch building a space-based Drydock ship. To help visualize the idea, I have a couple of rough sketches that I enlarged from my sketchbook. The design I'm going with features massive arms to cradle a damaged ship, pivoting booms that lock everything in place. On top of that, it'll have a fleet of repair shuttles to handle exterior fixes. This is going to be a fun build, so grab your tools and let's get started. For this build, I needed a solid core, something that could not only support all the styrene details, but also serve as a sturdy mounting point for the ship. To make it happen, I started with high-quality 1x2 pine. I cut two 12-inch pieces as the foundation. Once the pieces were cut, I cleaned up the edges and glued them together with standard wood glue to make a 1.5 by 1.5 inch solid chunk of wood. I made sure I clamped the pieces together so it'd be a strong bond and to help prevent any shifting of the wood while the glue cured. Of course, when you clamp the pieces of wood, there's always that glue that oozes out from in between the pieces that you have to clean up before it cures. So I made sure I did that before it dried to save myself from the hassle of scraping later. A smooth, flat surface is important for the styrene to stick to. While the glue cured, I prepped the styrene strips, and before attaching them, I did a final light sanding on the wood to ensure a perfect surface for adhesion. Normally I'd use 5-minute epoxy for this, but I decided to try superglue this time. Epoxy works great, but superglue cures faster and doesn't create as much of a mess. I was a little worried it wouldn't bond well, but it actually held up amazingly. I couldn't even peel the plastic off the wood once it cured. Next, I wrapped the end caps in styrene, ensuring full coverage of the core. With everything in place, I gave the edges a final sanding for a clean, professional finish. I also needed two mounting points. I'd wanted one in the center of the length and also one in the very back so I could have two spots to put in 5/16 inch threaded rods. To make sure they were held in place tight, I used 5-minute epoxy, ensuring that they wouldn't budge, and once cured, these inserts were locked in tight. There's no worries about them coming loose later. And with the core finished, it's time to move on to the main body structure, the real heart of the ship. To start construction of the main body, I designed some panels to be cut and scored on my silhouette cutter. This tool greatly aided me in making panels that were exactly the same and helped a ton in the process of gluing things up properly. I love the added versatility this tool has given me in building my ships. I definitely have the YouTube channel Sublight Drive to thank for posting a video about his cutter that pushed me over the edge to purchase one myself. The cutter was also great in creating the inner ribs for the main body. I like using these ribs on the inside of my builds to make a strong overall structure. I used primarily 30,000 styrene for the ribs and the main skin panels. I have used 40,000s for other builds, but I didn't think I would need the extra heft for this ship. To glue all these styrene ribs and shapes together, I used my favorite solvent, Weld-On 3. I love how thin this solvent is and how well it wicks into the seams by capillary action. One of the other things I like about this kind of glue is that it actually solvent welds the plastic together, essentially fusing it into a single piece. If you go this route, you can save a ton of money buying a quart of it and decanting it into your old glue bottle. This quart will easily last me for a couple of scratch builds. It's kind of funny, but with all the ribs now in place, this ship reminds me of an angelfish. If you've ever had an aquarium, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Before I put the top skin in place, I installed a couple of plastic tubes through the ribs to act as conduits to run power wires to what would eventually be the lights for the engines. This is the perfect time to put these in, as it would be hard to run wires once everything was closed in. I know I talked about loving how well Weld-On 3 works for styrene, but for gluing the large panels into the interior ribs, I used super glue. I put a thin bead in place and pressed the panel down until the glue cured. Once that had cured, I used the Weld-On around the perimeter to seal the rest of it together. I also made a couple of panel sections to add some visual interest to the overall shape. Besides engines that would light up, I also knew I wanted to have a bridge that you would be able to see into and have lights to light it up. But I didn't want to stop there. I also wanted to be able to see into the repair shuttle bay. I used Tinkercad to create all these objects, as well as the clamping arms that I'll eventually mount to the large outrigger arm structures. Before I took the next step of building the large outer legs of the ship, I needed to make sure the hangar bay I printed actually fit where I wanted it to go. Once I was good with that, I started the leg creation. I used styrene for these as well, which in this case was the same 30 thousandths that I used for the rest of the build, as well as a bunch of the triangle gussets that I had made in my silhouette cutter. These gussets do a great job with adding strength to the various structures. I love using styrene for the basic structure of my builds. It is super easy to work with, and once you mark where you want to cut, all you need to do is score the plastic, then snap it the rest of the way. The pieces might need a bit of cleanup with sandpaper, but it's typically not too bad. I also love my 1-2-3 blocks for helping to keep my pieces square when I'm gluing them up. All you need to do is prop your piece of plastic up against it and run a bit of the weld on along the joint you're gluing. If you're thinking about trying the 1-2-3 blocks, I'll put a link below for the ones I use. They're super handy. Once I had one of the legs complete, I repeated the process 3 more times and attached them all to the ship's main structure. I really like the way the ship sits with all 4 legs in place. After the legs were done and attached, I turned my attention to the nose structure and the fitting of the bridge in its proper spot. I actually printed 2 versions of the bridge. When I showed the first version to my wife, she was worried that there wasn't enough seating for everyone on the bridge. So I did some more work on the Tinkercad file and added a couple more chairs and even a safety bar across the back with padding. You never know when the flying conditions will get rough. Anyway, onto the painting of the bridge and hangar bay. I did a lot of fitting work with styrene to fit the shuttle bay and bridge in place, and once I liked how they fit, I applied a coat of primer and painted them with Vallejo acrylic paints. I also applied washes to give both of them the appearance of having some wear. I'm pleased with how they turned out. For the lighting on this build, I used 3-volt micro LEDs that I purchased from Amazon. For the bridge and the shuttle bay, I used warm white LEDs, and I originally tried the pure white LEDs, but they looked a little too bluish to me. I also used pure blue LEDs for the engine lights to mimic the look of heavy-duty ion engines. To run the power throughout the ship, I got some black and red 26-gauge wire, also from Amazon. This wire went to every spot where I was going to have LED lights. And all the LEDs will be run from a pair of AA batteries with a push-button switch. The battery compartment was originally on the top side, but it became too difficult to work it into the design of the ship, so I moved it to the underside. It works much better down there. Once I had all the wires run, I soldered everything together and used heat shrink tubing at all the joints. This will help prevent shorted connections during rough flying conditions. With all the power where it needs to be, I looked into the shuttle bay and the engines. I'm definitely pleased with how it's looking so far. And to minimize issues with light leaking throughout the plastic or 3D prints, I utilized shiny aluminum foil tape. This is the kind of tape you'd use on HVAC ductwork and does a great job with stopping the light leaks and reflecting any light back to where you want it to be. I had mentioned the engines a minute ago and just wanted to share that these were also designed in Tinkercad. My thought is that these are a heavy-duty ion engine that have a great record for reliability. I decided to name these the Jupiter class of ion engines. I just love the possibilities that 3D printing can offer for builds like these. You're truly only limited by your imagination. One of the things I like to do to add interest, texture, and depth to my builds is to add miscellaneous items to the skin of the ship. Some of the things I like to add are various bits of tubing, plastic, and metal rod. keys from keyboards, and just about anything else that looks interesting to me. As you watch me add the various pieces to the ship, let me tell you how I imagine this ship came to be. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, when more and more ships are created and launched to explore our local corner of the galaxy, there's an increasing chance of these ships breaking down and not able to return to Earth for repair. It was decided to create a space-based Drydock vessel that will go to the broken down ship. When a distress call comes along, the Drydock and its repair crew is dispatched to the location of the ship to initiate repairs. Initially, it would only be CQH Aerospace that is creating the ships, but I can envision a time when other private companies will start creating the repair vessels as it becomes more common to see private research and leisure ships traveling the galaxy. I'm sure it would also be likely that we'll see a company like AAA have a rescue service available to either repair or tow the broken vessels back to Earth. And if you're wondering how this ship got its name, let me tell you. I decided to call this ship the USS Bernard Arthur after my father. My dad was a mechanic by trade before retiring, and I thought this would be a perfect ship to name after him. I also thought it'd be an ideal ship to name after him due to how many times he had to come and rescue me out in the middle of nowhere in my car when it would break down. It only seems fitting. I even named the class of vessel the Panther class, which is named after his old high school mascot. Now you may be wondering just how this ship would even get any kind of communication from the derelict vessel in a decent time frame, especially if it's many light years away. Well, if you recall, some time back, an ancient satellite was discovered orbiting around one of the moons of Proxima Centauri. And it was discovered this satellite was actually a communications relay satellite that allowed the near instantaneous transmission of messages from one satellite to another. Utilizing the information gained from this discovery, a satellite system was created for Earth-based vessels to do the same, which allowed our ships to reach out if needed, and as long as a ship is within transmission range of a satellite, they can send a message to Earth. There isn't currently any spot being explored that is more than 5 light hours from one of these communication satellites. And as we speak, the quantum entanglement communication technology is being researched to be placed within the ships themselves, instead of needing a satellite to do the communications relaying. Now that you know how the communication gets to these ships, let me tell you what kind of repairs they can do. Depending on the distress call as received, these vessels can do everything from replacing an entire warp core down to recalibrating the anti-gravity emitter system. Each vessel has a complement of repair shuttles that have a gripper arm system that can do repairs to the external structures of the ship. There are also multiple grabber arms located on the bottom of the dry docks that can grab onto the derelict vessel to do repairs and to just hold everything in place. If needed, an elevator tube can also be extended between the bottom of the dry dock vessel and the derelict ship to enable easy transfer of repair crew to the broken down vessel, but only if feasible for the broken ship, as not all ships have an access port on the top side. So now that you know about the reason the ship was made, let's get back to more of the ship's construction. Before I move to the next step of construction, to spread the love, we had to add the required wooden heart to a hidden part of the ship. This ship has it added to the battery compartment, and as usual, this was placed by my wife, as she enjoys doing this part in all the ships and dioramas I make. Much like the warp exhaust on my Pathfinder build, I figured this ship would need something similar. My struggle was trying to figure out how to build a warp exhaust on the existing section of the ship that is protruding out without looking completely out of place. This section also had the other threaded hole for being able to mount it, just in case I ever wanted to do some green screen work with it. With that being said, I went back to Tinkercad and designed a large engine section from scratch that could be glued in place over the center area. I figured I could design it to look like it was some type of exhaust, as well as creating an object to screw in that looked like it was part of the structure. What I found to use was an idler wheel from the inside of an old camcorder. This was stuck to a bolt that fit the proper thread of the mounting hole. I do wish I used a bit shorter bolt though. This one is way too long. After I designed and 3D printed that section, I added some bits of styrene to give it more interest and to help hide the fact that it is a fully 3D printed part. I like how this turned out. It slid in place without issue, and once glued on, it wasn't going anywhere. And as you watch me adding some detail to the warp exhaust, I wanted to give a big shout out to my Patreon members. I truly appreciate you supporting my channel. Your support helps to pay for my supplies and materials to keep building all the ships and dioramas to share with everyone. And one last amazing thing, the hole I designed into the exhaust part lined up with a threaded insert on the ship on the first try. That kind of thing never happens for me. With the ship complete, it's time to put some primer on it and get it ready for paint. To help with ventilation, I took the ship down to our garage to apply a coat of gray primer. In the case of this build, I used Rust-Oleum flat gray primer in a spray can. There isn't really any super fine detail for me to worry about losing when primed, so I figured this type of primer is just fine. After the whole thing was primed, I took it back to the work table and decided to airbrush some Vallejo black paint around the panel edges to try and accentuate the panels. Once this dried, I airbrushed an ultra thin coat of dirty white paint over everything. I feel the effect the highlighted panels gives is very subtle, but overall is worth the look it gave. Once I had the coat of thinned white paint over everything, I started the process of detail painting. I airbrushed a coat of Vallejo jet exhaust color on the ion engines and gunmetal color on the warp exhaust. I then did some detail brush painting of the pipes with Vallejo oily steel color and various blacks, grays, and jet exhaust color for the various junction boxes and panels. After I got a bunch of the piping and panels painted, I turned my attention to making the inner ion engine trim rings. These were 3D printed and painted, and then I used a sandwich of frosted plastic as well as a fancy ribbon material I purchased from Walmart. This combination makes a great blend of light diffusion with visual interest to the engine interior. After that was complete, I started painting the 4 outrigger clamps. I used silver for the inner cylinders and safety yellow for the outer pipe structure. I can't wait to see how it looks once it's all weathered and rough looking. After I had painted the shuttle bay entrance runway, I wanted a set of safety lines put on. I made a paint mask with my silhouette cutter and airbrushed a thin coat of Vallejo white, then bright yellow over that. I allowed that to dry, then taped off a repeating pattern to airbrush black, to make alternating black and yellow safety lines. I'm pleased with how it turned out. After I finally had all the detail painting how I wanted it, I put a layer of paper down on my workspace and sprayed a good coat of Vallejo gloss varnish over the whole model. I waited for that to dry and started to place my custom-made laser printer water slide decals. I found a cool image of a panther head to place on the sides of the ship. As I mentioned earlier, this was the mascot of my dad's high school, and I thought it'd be cool to make the ship the Panther class of vessels. I also decided to designate the ship the DD-01. This is to signify it being a Drydock ship. I also thought the crew would like to put a small saying on the side of the ship, so I came up with, "No ship too far gone." This is to symbolize the crew's willingness to travel as far as they needed to repair a ship, as well as no vessel was too broken to be repaired by the crew. After I got my decals in place, I did some coloring in the spots I thought there'd be high wear with dark gray on a piece of sponge to dab it in place. Then I did some over that with oily steel color. The effect looks like the ship's coating came off in these spots. I figured if this was a repair ship, it'd probably look pretty rough in areas. Once everything was dry, I hit it all again with another thin coat of gloss varnish. Once that dried, I mixed up a grungy blend of gray oil paint with a bit of burnt sienna and odorless mineral spirits. I tested this color blend on the bottom side of the ship. I love the way all the color flows into the nooks and crannies and adds depth. After I was good with that coloring and flow, my wife took over on applying it to the rest of the vessel, while I started on some video editing. I love the way this turned out, so I also did the same thing with a grungy gray wash to add a bit more interest. Once all the mineral spirits evaporated from the color, I cleaned it up with cotton swabs and paper towel dabbed in clean mineral spirits. This left only the color in the various crevices and a general worn look to the ship. After all that was dried, I sprayed a generous coat of Vallejo matte varnish on the whole thing. And once that dried, I removed all the masking and called this ship done. Thank you so much for watching this video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll always know when I release new videos.